There is a thought that has stayed with me for a long time, and the more honestly I examine my own life, the more certain I become that it carries something most of us quietly know, but rarely stop to face. The life you are living right now is not happening to you, it is happening because of you. Not because of the big decisions, the dramatic turning points, or the rare moments when everything suddenly becomes clear. It is happening because of the small, invisible, almost forgettable choices made on ordinary days, when nobody was watching and nothing felt particularly important. That idea used to make me uncomfortable. I suspect it makes a lot of people uncomfortable, because accepting it means accepting something difficult. It means the version of yourself you keep promising to become is not waiting on better circumstances, it is waiting on better choices. And those choices are available right now, today, in this moment, before anything else changes. But here is what most people never realize. The ancient Stoics understood something about human nature that most modern thinking still struggles to fully accept. They knew that people do not suffer most from what happens to them. They suffer most from the distance between who they are and who they sense they could become. That gap does not close through ambition alone. It does not close through motivation or inspiration or the right opportunity appearing at the right time. It closes through something far less dramatic and far more demanding. It closes through the quiet, daily, unglamorous work of choosing differently, repeatedly, long before the results become visible to anyone, including yourself. Most of us carry a version of the future inside us that feels just slightly out of reach. There is a calmer version of ourselves we keep imagining, a version that handles difficulty with more grace, speaks with more honesty, wastes less time, and moves through life with a sense of direction that does not depend on how the day happens to unfold. We admire that version, we think about that version, and then, more often than we would like to admit, we return to the familiar patterns that have always been easier than changing them. This is not weakness, it is deeply human. The brain is not designed to seek transformation, it is designed to seek efficiency, and efficiency usually means repeating what it already knows. The mind follows worn paths because worn paths require less effort. Every familiar habit, even the ones that quietly hold you back, feels safer than the unfamiliar territory of becoming someone slightly different. This is why understanding alone has never been enough to create lasting change. You can spend an entire evening reading about discipline and still find yourself reaching for your phone at the first sign of discomfort the following morning. Knowledge informs, but only repeated action actually reshapes who you are. Now here is the paradox that changes everything. Think about the last time you genuinely tried to change something important about yourself. Maybe it was waking up earlier, or being more patient with the people you love, or finally doing the work you kept telling yourself mattered. For a few days, perhaps even a few weeks, you felt the momentum of genuine commitment. Something in you felt different, more intentional, more alive. And then something happened. Not necessarily anything dramatic, perhaps just a difficult day, a stretch of tiredness, a moment when the old familiar comfort called louder than the new, unfamiliar discipline. And slowly, without any single decision to give up, you drifted back to where you started. Not because you lacked the desire to change, but because desire, without structure and repetition, has a very short shelf life. The Stoics did not trust desire, they trusted practice. Marcus Aurelius did not sit down each morning and wait to feel inspired before deciding how to live. He was Emperor of Rome, commanding the largest empire in the ancient world, surrounded by flattery, distraction, and every comfort imaginable. And yet each morning, before the demands of the day arrived, he wrote to himself. Not to feel better, not to impress anyone, but because he understood that the mind left to itself tends to wander toward comfort, and direction requires constant, quiet reinforcement. The inner life is not something that simply exists. It is something that must be tended, the same way a garden requires daily attention, not because plants grow overnight, but because without consistent care, weeds fill every space that discipline left empty. Something even deeper is happening here. The idea that your character is not fixed, that it is not something you were born with or handed by circumstance. It is something being shaped every single day, whether you are paying attention to the shaping or not. Every response you give when someone frustrates you is quietly strengthening either patience or reactivity. Every moment you choose to keep working when you could stop is either building or eroding your relationship with your own discipline. Every time you speak honestly when a comfortable lie would have gone unnoticed, you are adding something real to the person you are becoming, and every time you do the opposite, you are also adding something. The process never pauses. It simply continues, in whichever direction your choices are pointing. The future does not reward intentions, it remembers habits. What makes this both sobering and genuinely encouraging is what it reveals about time. Most people think of time as something they are running out of. The Stoics thought of time as something they were responsible for. Every hour carries within it the possibility of small but real change. Not the kind of change that looks impressive to anyone watching from the outside, but the kind that slowly, almost invisibly, shifts the ground beneath your feet. A single conversation where you listened more than you spoke. A single morning where you honored the commitment you made to yourself the night before. A single moment where you caught the familiar impulse to react and chose instead to pause and respond. These things seem insignificant while they are happening. Measured across months and years, they become the difference between a life that feels lived on purpose and a life that simply passed. Seneca observed that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. That observation is not meant to create guilt, it is meant to create attention, because attention is the beginning of everything. You cannot change what you are not noticing. You cannot improve a pattern you have never stopped to examine. Most of the habits that keep people stuck exist beneath the level of conscious awareness. They run quietly in the background, producing the same feelings and the same choices and the same results, while the person experiencing them wonders why nothing seems to change despite their genuine desire for something different. And this is where everything changes. The first and perhaps most important practice is simply the willingness to look, not with judgment, not with the harsh self-criticism that tends to make things worse rather than better, but with honest, patient observation. Consider your own life for a moment. What are you actually doing with the hours of your day? Not what you intend to do, not what you planned when the week began. What are you actually doing? What thoughts do you return to most often when your mind is unoccupied? What do you reach for when discomfort arrives? Your phone, a familiar distraction, the comfortable numbness of endlessly scrolling through other people's carefully arranged lives. What do you avoid when effort becomes required? These questions are not comfortable, but they are the questions that create the possibility of real movement, because they locate the place where change must begin, which is never in the external world, but always within the honest examination of your own inner life. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes from self-deception, and it is made more painful by the fact that it often goes unrecognized for years. It is the suffering of someone who believes they want something deeply, but whose daily choices are quietly moving in the opposite direction. Someone who says they want peace, but feeds their mind a constant diet of noise and complaint. Someone who says they want to feel stronger, but avoids every situation that might require strength. Someone who says they want meaningful relationships but never makes the time or offers the vulnerability that meaningful relationships actually demand. The gap between what people say they want and how they actually spend their days is often the most honest map of where their real commitments lie. Comfort rarely announces the price it will eventually collect. This is not an accusation, it is an invitation. Because the moment you can see that gap clearly, without defensiveness and without despair, something becomes possible that was not possible before. You can begin making choices that close it, slowly, imperfectly, with inevitable setbacks and occasional failures, but genuinely. One small decision at a time in the direction of the person you have decided you actually want to become. But now comes the difficult part. Epictetus, who was born into slavery and spent his early years under the authority of a cruel master who once broke his leg simply to demonstrate control, understood something about freedom that many people living in comfort still have not grasped. He understood that freedom is not the absence of constraint, it is the mastery of your own response. You cannot control what happens around you. You cannot control how other people treat you, what opportunities appear or disappear, which seasons of life bring abundance and which bring loss. But you can control, through practice and through discipline, the quality of your inner response to all of it. That control, quiet and invisible and never complete, is the only real freedom anyone has ever possessed. And it grows not through wishing, but through use. Think about how you currently respond to difficulty, not the catastrophic kind, because most of life is not catastrophic, but the ordinary kind. The plans that fall apart unexpectedly, the person who misunderstands you despite your best effort, the project that demands more than you anticipated, the season of life that refuses to move as quickly as you hoped. These ordinary difficulties are not interruptions to your real life. They are your real life. And the way you meet them, quietly, privately, when no audience is present to admire your response, is where your character is actually being formed. The Stoics spoke often about the obstacle as the path, not as a comforting phrase, but as a genuinely different way of understanding what challenges are for. Every difficulty contains within it the specific material needed to develop the quality most required at that moment. Impatience is not cured by easier circumstances. It is cured by practicing patience inside difficult ones. Fear is not dissolved by the removal of uncertainty. It is gradually transformed by acting with care and intention while uncertainty remains. Confidence is not built by waiting for guaranteed outcomes. It grows through the accumulation of moments where you acted despite doubt and discovered you were more capable than your fear had suggested. Every repeated choice becomes tomorrow's identity. This means that the life you are living right now, with all its frustrations and uncertainties and unresolved situations, is not something to be endured until better days arrive. It is the exact material from which a better version of yourself is being made, if you will let it. If you will stop treating difficulty as evidence that something has gone wrong and start treating it as evidence that something important is being strengthened. Yet this is only half of the story. There is a quietness to this kind of progress that can be disorienting at first. We live in a world that celebrates visible, dramatic transformation, before and after stories, sudden breakthroughs, moments of clarity that change everything overnight. Real growth rarely looks like that. Real growth looks like waking up on a morning when you do not feel like it and doing the thing you committed to anyway. It looks like staying present in a conversation when your mind wants to drift elsewhere. It looks like choosing honesty when a comfortable half-truth would have gone unnoticed. It looks like returning, after a setback, to the same quiet practices that were interrupted, without drama, and without excessive self-judgment. Just returning, and beginning again. The returning is not failure, it is the practice itself. Every meaningful path includes departure and return, departure and return. The person who eventually builds a life of genuine strength and steadiness is not the one who never loses their footing. It is the one who has learned, through experience, that losing your footing is part of walking, and that the only real mistake is stopping entirely. Notice something here that most people overlook entirely. The most underestimated form of courage is not the courage to begin. It is the courage required to continue when nothing visible confirms that continuing is worth it. Early in any meaningful effort, results are invisible. The discipline feels like it should be producing something by now. The patience feels like it has gone on long enough without reward. The honesty and the effort and the quiet consistency feel like they deserve more acknowledgement than they are receiving. This is the moment most people quietly give up. Not dramatically, not with a definitive decision to quit, but through gradual erosion. Through small exceptions that slowly become the new normal. One skipped morning becomes two. One avoided conversation becomes a pattern. One night of distraction becomes the default way evenings are spent. The Stoics understood something surprising about this particular form of surrender. They recognized that giving up rarely feels like a decision. It feels like rest. It feels like reasonableness. The mind convinces itself that the pause is temporary, that the real effort will resume once the current season of difficulty has passed. But seasons have a way of extending themselves when they are being used as reasons to wait. Seneca captured this with devastating clarity. He described how people postpone living while they are busy arranging their lives. They tell themselves that everything will properly begin once certain conditions are finally in place, once the situation at work settles, once the relationship finds its footing, once the finances improve, once they feel ready. But readiness, as the Stoics understood, is not a feeling that arrives. It is a condition you create through action, not through waiting for it. Here is a question worth sitting with honestly. How many things in your life are you postponing because you are waiting to feel ready? Not because the preparation is genuinely incomplete, but because readiness feels like a safer reason to wait than the truth, which is simply that beginning feels uncertain, and uncertain things are uncomfortable. The mind is extraordinarily skilled at constructing reasonable arguments for delay. It speaks in the language of wisdom while quietly serving the interests of comfort. It says, "Now is not the right time," as though time has a better version of itself waiting somewhere ahead. It says, "You need to think about this more," as though more thinking has ever replaced the irreplaceable information that only action can provide. This is where the Stoic practice of making the choice before the feeling arrives becomes essential. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this in ways that still feel startlingly contemporary. He described the moment each morning when the mind attempts to negotiate, when it suggests that remaining in bed a little longer is reasonable, that the work can wait, that today is not the day for difficulty. He recognized that this voice was not wisdom, it was familiarity defending itself. And he wrote those words not as someone who found discipline easy, but as someone who found it necessary and chose it anyway, day after day, in the private moments before the world was watching. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. That line from his own journals was not poetry. It was a practical observation about how the mind is shaped by what it repeatedly returns to. Someone who spends most of their inner life rehearsing resentment gradually becomes a resentful person, not because they chose resentment as an identity, but because repetition makes familiar what was once simply occasional. Someone who regularly returns their attention to what they can control, what they can improve, what they can offer, gradually becomes someone whose default response to difficulty is curiosity rather than collapse. The inner life is not a fixed landscape, it is a garden, and you are its keeper, whether you accept that responsibility or not. Something even more fundamental is happening beneath all of this. Most conversations about self-improvement focus on behavior. Do more of this, less of that. Wake earlier, work harder, procrastinate less. These are not wrong suggestions, but they address the surface of a much deeper question, because the habits that hold people back most reliably are not habits of action, they are habits of interpretation. The story you tell yourself about what is happening, about what difficulty means, about what failure reveals, about what other people's success says about your own possibilities, this inner narration shapes everything else. It runs constantly beneath the level of conscious awareness, coloring every experience before you have had the chance to examine it. Two people can receive the same criticism and have entirely different experiences of it. One hears confirmation of a fear they have carried for years. The other hears information they can use. Neither response was chosen consciously in the moment. Both responses were shaped by the stories those two people had been quietly rehearsing long before the criticism arrived. This is the territory the Stoics explored with the greatest care. Not the external world, which remained largely beyond their control, but the internal world of judgment, interpretation, and the assumptions that sit invisibly beneath every response. Pause for a moment and consider what this means in practical terms. The anxiety that arrives when you check your messages and see something unexpected is not created by the message itself. It is created by what your mind immediately decides the message means. The frustration that rises when a plan falls apart is not caused by the disruption. It is caused by the expectation that things were supposed to unfold differently. The shame that follows a mistake is not an inevitable response to having made one. It is shaped by the internal judgment you apply to the fact of the mistake, a judgment that has been practiced over years and now arrives automatically. None of this is your fault, but all of it is your responsibility. And this distinction between fault and responsibility is one of the most important shifts in perspective that Stoic philosophy offers. Fault looks backward and assigns blame. Responsibility looks forward and asks what is now within your power to address. One keeps you anchored to what cannot be changed. The other quietly returns your attention to what can. Here is where the real transformation begins, and why it is slower than most people hope. Changing a habit of interpretation is not as simple as deciding to think differently. The mind does not update itself on command. Every familiar response has been strengthened through repetition, sometimes over decades, until it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like simply the way things are, the way you are. And when something feels like identity rather than habit, questioning it feels threatening in a way that goes much deeper than ordinary discomfort. This is why Epictetus spoke about philosophical practice with the same seriousness that an athlete speaks about physical training. You are not arguing with a single thought. You are gradually reshaping the deep patterns of response that have quietly directed your life, often without your awareness, for a very long time. That kind of reshaping requires patience of a different order than most people are prepared to offer. But the signs of progress, when they begin to appear, are unmistakable. You notice the familiar impulse arising, and you pause before following it. You catch yourself constructing the old story, and you ask whether it is actually true or simply well practiced. You feel the pull toward distraction, and you remain present anyway, not because remaining present is comfortable, but because you have slowly come to understand what the cost of absence actually is. Every one of these moments is small, every one of them matters. There is something that happens to a person who has practiced this long enough, something that is difficult to describe, but unmistakable when you encounter it in someone else. They carry a quality of steadiness that does not depend on conditions being favorable. They can disagree without becoming hostile. They can fail without becoming defined by failure. They can receive praise without requiring it. They can sit with uncertainty without needing it resolved before they can continue functioning. This steadiness is not coldness. It is not detachment or indifference to the texture of life. It is the opposite. It is a kind of deep, grounded presence that is only possible when you are no longer spending most of your energy protecting yourself from reality. When you have stopped arguing with what is and started working with what remains within your reach. Cato the Younger demonstrated this quality in circumstances that most people will never face. As the Roman Republic collapsed around him and the political order he had spent his life defending crumbled beyond recovery, he did not abandon his principles to survive more comfortably in the new order. He understood that the external battle was lost, but he also understood that the internal battle, the question of who he would remain in the face of that loss, was still entirely his own. The steadiness he maintained was not stubbornness. It was the visible expression of a character that had been built through decades of quiet, daily, private practice long before the crisis arrived. Most people will never face that magnitude of external loss, but the same principle applies to the ordinary losses and disappointments that shape every life. The promotion that does not arrive despite genuine effort. The relationship that ends despite real care. The years invested in a direction that eventually reveals itself as the wrong one. These moments test not your talent or your intelligence, but the quality of the inner foundation you have been building, often without realizing that building was happening at all. Now comes the part that most people find most difficult to accept. The greatest investment you will ever make is not in a skill, a strategy, or an opportunity. It is in the quality of your own attention, because attention is not simply something you pay, it is something you practice. And whatever you practice attending to becomes, over time, the dominant landscape of your inner life. Someone who spends most of their attention comparing their life to carefully curated images of other people's lives gradually trains their mind to experience their own existence as perpetually insufficient. Not because their life is actually insufficient, but because comparison has become the default lens. And comparison is a lens that can make any life feel like it is falling short of an imaginary standard. Someone who repeatedly returns their attention to what is genuinely present, to the quality of the work in front of them, to the person they are actually in conversation with, to the small but real pleasures of an ordinary day, gradually builds a mind that is capable of finding meaning in circumstances that a distracted mind would overlook entirely. This is not a suggestion to ignore ambition or stop pursuing meaningful goals. The Stoics were not advocates of passivity. Marcus Aurelius led military campaigns. Seneca built extraordinary influence. Epictetus taught philosophy to hundreds of students who traveled great distances to learn from him. All of them pursued meaningful work with genuine commitment. The difference was that none of them required the work to succeed in order to remain whole. Their sense of self did not depend on outcomes they could not fully control. They were invested without being imprisoned by their investments. And that distinction between caring deeply and depending desperately is what allowed them to act with clarity in circumstances where most people would have been paralyzed by anxiety or overwhelmed by the weight of possible failure. Every repeated action is a quiet vote for the person you are becoming. Think about what you have voted for today, not in the moments of deliberate choice, but in the small, automatic, barely noticed decisions that filled the spaces between. The conversation you had with yourself while waiting, the thing you reached for when you had a free moment, The response you gave before you had time to think about it, the version of events you constructed in your mind when something did not go as expected. These moments feel too small to matter. They are not. They are the ballots that determine the election. And the election is not held once. It is held continuously, in every ordinary hour of every ordinary day, shaping the character that will eventually meet whatever the future decides to bring. There is something worth sitting with quietly as you move forward from here. The future you have been hoping for, the calmer, steadier, more purposeful version of your life, is not waiting for you to finally figure everything out. It is not waiting for circumstances to align perfectly or for some internal readiness to announce itself with sufficient clarity. It is being shaped right now by what you choose to practice, by what you choose to notice, by what you choose to return to after each departure. The path has never required perfection. It has only ever required the consistent willingness to return. Marcus Aurelius, after decades of ruling the most powerful empire in the ancient world, wrote in the final pages of his journal, not with triumph, but with instruction. He reminded himself again of the same principles he had been practicing for years, not because he had forgotten them, but because he understood that the mind requires ongoing tending, that wisdom is not a destination reached once and then permanently occupied. It is a direction you choose again and again, in the morning, in the difficult afternoon, in the quiet evening when no one else is watching, and the only question is who you are choosing to be. That is what the Stoics ultimately offered. Not a system for achieving more, not a philosophy for making life easier, but a way of meeting life as it actually is, with clear eyes, steady attention, and the quiet confidence of someone who understands that while the external world may remain beyond their control, the quality of their inner response never has to be. The life you are building is already underway. It has always been underway. The only question that remains is whether the choices accumulating in these ordinary moments are building it in the direction you have genuinely chosen. Begin there, return there, and trust that the work being done in the quiet, unwitnessed hours of an ordinary life is the most important work any person can do. Long before the world sees what you are becoming, you will know, and that knowledge, earned through genuine effort and sustained through honest practice, is where everything meaningful has always begun.